I'm interviewing Professor Paul Moan, who is the Professor of History here at Auckland University of Technology, and he's going to explain to us in 5 minutes, this is 5 minutes with Professor Paul Moan, why Te Reo Maori is New Zealand's second official language, next to English and also sign language, but New Zealanders generally don't speak Te Reo Maori, and there are very, very few non-Māori fluent speakers of Te Reo Maori. And I just want to set the scene a little bit and explain that, you know, in the 2013 census, the proportion of Māori able to hold an everyday conversation in the Māori language, it decreased over about a 10-year period between 96 and 2013. So in 2013, only 21.3% of the Māori population, which was almost 600,000, could hold a conversation about a lot of everyday things in Te Reo Maori. And when we're thinking about our theme for this class, which is the Pacific, New Zealand, a colonial imagination, I remember I had a conversation with Paul where he explained to me that one of the markers of colonisation was looking at the language which dominates a country. And for, you know, the British colonies, when English dominates the colony and the Indigenous language or the native language becomes subordinate, you can see that that is a real marker of colonisation. Now, the majority of the Māori population, similar to the Pacific population in New Zealand, are young people. And, you know, it's really interesting getting a take on young people, especially young men, who feature highly in all the wrong statistics like crime and poor health and poor education. But to get a take on what young Māori and Pacific Island men think about their world and their place in the world. And this is an excerpt from a spoken word poem by Te Kahu Rolliston, who's from Tauranga, a city in the Western Bay of Plenty, and he's Ngaiterangi. And he says, "We were once of this land, physical and spiritual natives. Now we are just on this land, all day, hooked on Facebook, YouTube, consumed digital natives." So for him, the shift between pre-contact and colonisation and post-colonisation is that shift between being a physical and spiritual native who is of the land to becoming on the land and being now a digital native. This is an excerpt from Joshua Yosefo, who's a Pacific Islander of South Auckland, and this is a TEDx course, TEDx talk that Joshua did when he was only 17 years old, and he was a high school boy. He was a year 13 high school student, and he said, 1970s Auckland, dawn raid. That was a name given to a time when my people were forced out of their homes and into somewhere else. The somewhere else became my home, a place where me and a whole lot of other kids have known all our lives, South Auckland. See, we live in South Auckland all our lives, seeing it as a place as well as a prison. There's an invisible border that separates South Auckland from the rest of Auckland, a border which tries to stop potential from getting out, as well as trying to stop opportunities from getting in. See, South Auckland is the hub of crime for Auckland, thriving with Māori and Pacific Islanders, low academic achievers, and those who are living off the government. I was born into this. This is my home, surrounded by what I like to call an invisible border. Okay, so after setting up the context of our second lecture, I'll give it to Paul. This is 5 minutes with Professor Paul Moan. You know, why don't we speak Te Reo Maori in New Zealand? What happened?
Okay, well, thanks, Teena. There are probably two reasons for that. They're both quite complex, but I'll hopefully try to simplify them. They are motive and the nature of language. When it comes to motive, if you take Europe, for example, the vast majority of people in Europe don't speak English as their first language, but the vast majority of people in Europe speak English as a second language, and often to a very accomplished standard. Now, what's the motive for that? Well, if we're very clear about it, it's to do with self-interest, that people learn English around the world because they can see it gives them opportunities for travel, but particularly for employment. So self-interest is what guides people to learn second languages and become quite fluent in them. if you look at the reasons given by various organisations in New Zealand to learn Te Reo Maori, the reasons are quite different. They say that we've got to focus on preserving the language. We have to learn the language in order to protect the culture, and we have to learn it because it's part of our heritage. Now, none of those are good reasons. They sound very noble, but they're not good reasons, and more importantly, they're not reasons that actually succeed. They fail as reasons to motivate people to learn the language. So when we look at why is it that New Zealanders don't learn Te Reo, simple answer is there's no benefit in them for doing that. So if you want to change that, it's quite simple. You pass a law that says 50 years from now, or 20 years from now, whenever, the vast majority, perhaps 70-80% of state employees have to be fluent in Te Reo. And you'll see a flood of people wanting to learn the language because they will see some personal benefit out of it, some job benefit. So motives is a key part, and the people who are directing language policy in New Zealand have, I think, very, very much a case of high levels of goodwill, but they're completely going down the wrong path, and they're trying to encourage people to learn a language in a way that continues to fail year after year. The second point about it is the nature of language itself, and this is obviously a bit more complex. Most people would describe language as a way of communicating, as a way of couching culture and couching views and so on. But at its essence, language, if you can use the metaphor, is almost like a living organism. That is, that it's something that, and it's often, the phrase is often used, it's a living language. But the nature of organisms is not just that they live, but they reproduce and expand. Every single organism does that. They don't just continue in the same strength, they either expand or they disappear. So whenever you have two languages together, if you use that metaphor of a living organism, one of them is going to expand to the exact same proportion that the other one contracts. So if English expands, it has to be to the detriment of other languages in New Zealand. There's no country on earth that has a perfect balance. And people say, well, Canada's got English and French, but French is very much in the retreat in Canada because the nature of the organism of English is distinct from just about any other language on earth because it's an unusual language. If you look at Te Reo Maori, for example, you can easily trace its paternity back to the Pacific and then several thousand years before that back into parts of Asia. But if you look at English, it's a mongrel, it's a hybrid of all these different languages, and the great feature it has is that it's able to plant itself in a new place, adjust to local circumstances and the local environment, and then start to propagate itself at the expense of local languages. And it's done that all over the world, not just in Indigenous countries, but also in advanced Western countries. English is making inroads as well. It's got to the point now with the last 100 years or so, particularly the nature of globalization, that it's a force that is almost unstoppable. And you'd be hard-pressed to find any example in the world of an Indigenous language that's fighting back against English. And there are a lot of people who say, well, look, we've achieved this, more people speak it, and so on. But the nature of that organism is that it continues to expand, it continues to colonise and propagate itself. And if the environment is harsh, it will adjust according to that. And the whole history of English is one of continual expansion in the last 400 or 500 years. And the last century in particular, rapid expansion at the expense of other languages. So there's those two forces that militate against the survival of Te Reo, and so I think there needs to be some quite dramatic rethink if there's any hope of saving the language.